G'day SkinClub community, Elfishguy back once again with another one for you exclusively on the SkinClub platforms. Today I wanted to talk about something positive. I think generally speaking over the last sort of like 2 years or so, there's been quite a bit of doom and gloom when it's come to counterstrike esports. You know, obviously the change into CS2, there was some issues with that. The state of the game, people weren't super happy with. The state of the teams, everyone was sort of saying, oh, the ecosystem right now is extremely weak. We don't have that many good teams. The level of Counter-Strike is not that good. But I want to go in a different direction now, going into sort of the middle stages of 2025. I made a tweet the other day, and for those that are audio listeners only, I'll just read it quickly here. It says, I feel Counter-Strike esports is entering a golden era in 2025. Vitality versus Falcons rivalry already looking to be a good one, and then there's still Spirit and MOUZ lurking in the wings. Plus, we've got a bunch of cool teams just a step below them with the likes of Mongols, Aurora, Liquid, Na'Vi, etc. There's probably another couple of names that you could fit in there, but you know, I hit the tweet limit, so I had to just leave it at that. I think there's a lot to kind of break down there, but I'll start with the fact that we've got, I feel like now, 4 great teams that are kind of hitting that elite level, maybe even some cases that super elite level, that are really hitting their stride in 2025, right? And of course, you know, we kind of have to start with Vitality being that first team. They are the undisputed number 1. They're on that 25-game win streak, and it really feels like they've kind of hit like the golden 5 with the addition of ROPS. And I feel like we're sort of at that point now where we may even be starting to get into the discussion about greatest team of all time, depending on how things kind of go throughout the rest of this year, right? As we head into the Austin Major, if they do well there, if they maintain this streak and get further past, 30 games or something like that, people are kind of already starting to come around to where do they sit in like this best team of all time discussion. You know, this Astralis, SK, Liquid, Fnatic, NIP, obviously all these kinds of teams. You know, where does Vitality kind of sit in there? I think they're certainly within the top 5 for me, at least, and potentially even starting to now push into a top 3 discussion, just because I think the era that they're doing it in is starting to become quite a solid era in Counter-Strike in terms of the overall history of the game. But look, there's a lot of positives to be said about having a team like Vitality at the top. They're playing great Counter-Strike right now. They're very, very exciting to watch. And I think the most interesting thing to me is, like, how long can they keep this streak going, right? They've just won the Grand Slam. They're looking to win the Major. Obviously, they've said that that's a really, really big factor for them as well. But I think for me personally, as a viewer and as a fan of Counter-Strike, just seeing how long this win streak can go is kind of cool as well. Obviously, you've got Spirit and MOUZ in there as well, who have been like the competitors, I suppose, for the first 5 months of this year. And I think they're both actually playing quite a good level of Counter-Strike. And in general, maybe even a surprisingly good level. In the case of MOUZ, I think people were obviously quite right in their questions about Brolin coming into the in-game leadership role, but it doesn't seem like MOUZ have really dropped off all that much. In fact, they've even been playing, I think, pretty well. Spirit, again, the donk factor, that's always going to be fun to watch. They're kind of like nipping on the heels all the time of Vitality, and while they're fairly consistently losing to Vitality, you get the sense that, one good game, one good moment, and Spirit could be right back in there. So I think they're doing a great job, those two, the Spirit and MOUZ, of kind of like just keeping Vitality honest, keeping them working hard. Good series coming out of those matchups, generally speaking. And they're also doing a really good job of like essentially kind of like gatekeeping the other teams out of the top 4, if that makes sense. We've got like this really, really strong kind of robust, almost top 4, thanks to Falcons, which is kind of where I want to go with this one as well, because I feel like now that we've got the addition of Falcons into like this top 4 position, it really does feel like we've actually got quite a competitive bunch of teams at the top end. And yes, they are currently being dominated by Vitality, but Spirit, MOUZ, Falcons, it feels like could beat one another on any given day. And on their day, as we've even seen with the case of Falcons, really only just losing to Vitality in a couple of finals now, I think you could really make an argument that they're at some point close to beating Vitality. So it feels like the top 4 to me is really, really competitive. And I'm very interested to see where this Falcons team goes, right? Obviously, since the addition of m0NESY, it looks like they're really coming online. They played really, really well in Melbourne and in Lisbon. And even prior to Melbourne, prior to the addition of m0NESY, they were, I feel like, really kind of like starting to turn around a little bit some of the discourse that was going on. So I think this roster is going to be the real deal, and I think, to be honest, there could be a whole video discussing where this roster can go, how they can go about it, and what level they could hit. But with or without further tweaks to this roster, I actually think this is going to be a really, really competitive team going into, obviously, the Austin Major as well, but throughout the rest of 2025. It seems like it's a very reinvigorated m0NESY, Nico, even the Falcons organization / team seem like they're finally kind of like getting where they want to get, which is really, really cool. So I'm kind of at that point now where I feel like we're able to make the argument that this is probably the strongest and most competitive top 4 that we've had since Counter-Strike 2's release. And just because Vitality is kind of like dominating at this current moment, that doesn't mean that the rest of the teams here aren't good. I think their dominance is actually made even more impressive by the strength of the other rosters that we've got. And I think largely that does come down to the fact that Falcons has joined the big three, and it's no longer a discussion of, well, previously it was really just Vitality versus Spirit, and then MOUZ was kind of like there as that third fiddle almost. And then you'd be looking at teams like maybe Mongols, Aurora, G2 at some points potentially as being like a discussion point for like a playoffs top four kind of thing. But I think if we've got a really solid top four, that first of all gives you some excellent semifinals and probably some really, really good finals. And then we bring that discussion further on down to the contender teams that are kind of sitting around at the moment, that can bring us into like quarterfinal appearances, top 8 performances, playoff performances that are on some days good, or you can at least see the potential there. I'm talking about, Mongols and Aurora, who, look, I still think that they have been a bit up and down throughout 2025, but I think on their day, they could really still give a pretty interesting game, even to potentially some of those top 4 teams. I don't think that they're necessarily going to be able to beat them, but if they could at least push them, I think that will be something that we're looking forward to. And obviously, if they can overcome their playoffs jitters, right, that's where they can continue to become a threat. Right now, they do feel a bit like group stage merchants in a sense, but, you can get some good series out of them, and I think people are still quite excited, especially in the case of the Mongols, about what they're going to be able to bring in the future, because it is such a young team. Liquid's another one that we can talk to as well. They are rebuilding right now with Shui. I think it's a pretty interesting prospect on the surface. They just made their first playoffs appearance with that roster in Melbourne, and they went down to the Mongols, but it was a pretty exciting game. So I think with more time, they're going to really come online, and obviously they've made that change with the idea of going to the major with Shui and doing what they can there. So I think they've probably given themselves that sort of 3-month window that you kind of need as a new team to really be able to integrate this new in-game leader and see if that works stylistically speaking. So I think they're a pretty exciting team to kind of keep an eye on as well. And I think given time, they will join Aurora and Mongols in that like step below the tier 4 or tier 1, the big 4, if you will. So they'll be, again, another team that's kind of just like pushing the barrier a little bit. That maybe isn't quite there just yet in the top 4. But that's where I think, Liquid can kind of slot in. You've also got Gamer Legion, who are on a slow and steady rise, and I think they're also a pretty cool team to be keeping an eye on. I think four out of the 5 of them made their first arena playoffs appearance at IEM Melbourne. So, you can see that progression coming through for Gamer Legion as well. And they're almost, to me, like in this Mongols-esque tier of 12 months ago. Like if we remember where Mongols was at 12 months ago, starting to kind of make playoffs appearance, starting to look like a team that might be able to kind of like jostle for, let's say, a top 10 position comfortably, or a top 8 position, or a top 5 position on their good day. Gamer Legion feels at the moment kind of like a team that could get there, with the likes of G2 and FaZe and maybe even Na'Vi, you could say, kind of having some issues. I don't know that I would necessarily have them beating Na'Vi, for example, on a consistent basis, but G2 and FaZe probably feels reasonably realistic at this point in time for a team like Gamer Legion. And of course, now that we've got G2 and FaZe in that conversation as well, I mean, rebuilding and rejigging their rosters, especially with someone like Simple coming back into the fold here for FaZe, just for the major. Look, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a long-term fix for what's going on with FaZe, but I think that's a really exciting prospect again. See what Simple can do coming back on in. The only negative I'll say to that is, Simple keeps coming back into these teams that are obviously having issues. So it's like, are you realistically going to be seeing the best version of Simple? Probably not when he's back in Falcons at the RMR last year. Probably not when he's in FaZe here, that's obviously undergoing some kinds of issues. But who knows? Maybe he can do something. And again, if we get Simple back into the fold alongside Zawu, alongside Dong, alongside m0NESY, alongside Nico, alongside all these other big names that really feel like they're kind of like peaking in 2025, or having really good form in 2025, or kind of coming back into their own this year, I think that'll be a really, really cool storyline that we should be looking forward to. So in general, Again, in addition to that top 4 discussion, I think we can make the argument that the field right now, down to maybe the top 10, is about as strong as it's been for a very, very long time. And I think it's also great that we've got representation from every region as well, in some way, shape, or form. I know people don't give a shit about Asian Counter-Strike, but I do. And North America, they have Liquid in there that, again, they can kind of cheer for a little bit. So I think that that's really cool that, everyone's got somebody to cheer for in a sense, right? On top of all of that discussion, let's just move it away from the Counter-Strike and the gameplay itself for a little bit. Let's talk about viewership. And again, I think this is a big reason why, or it's even maybe an indicator, more so than a reason why we're kind of entering a golden era of CS esports in 2025, is that the viewership numbers are just going absolutely bananas, right? Katowice was the most popular non-major CS tournament in history, so that's a record broken. Pro League 2021, highest average viewership record for Pro Leagues, I believe. IEM Melbourne being the second most popular tournament of the year, just behind Cato, and I think also it was the third most popular non-major tournament in CS history, if I remember rightly. That's an insane statistic to me. Obviously, that's helped out by the Grand Slam. It's helped out by the Vitality Falcons Grand Final, which went all the way to 5, which was like a massive game for viewership. But it's on a bad time zone for an NA audience. It's on a pretty rough time zone for an EU audience. I think most of the matches were starting around like 9, 10 a.m. in Europe, which is not awful, but it's not fantastic. And yet that's one of the most popular tournaments that is not a major in CS history. It's doing crazy viewership numbers. So that's a really positive sign to me as well. And then Blast Rival Spring also just reached the highest viewership for a Blast Premier event as well. So just throughout 2025, we're kind of like seeing all these viewership records kind of like broken. I think really that's a result of multiple factors, right? We've got good teams, obviously, as we've discussed. We've got great storylines as well, again, as we've discussed. And there's a major on the horizon, which is now going to be the peak of the season, which I think is a fantastic change of course as well. So shout out to Valve for that one. Having the major be, the culmination of this entire season. We're already getting a really, really good season of Counter-Strike here in the first quarter/first half of 2025. And if that is then culminated by a really, really good final in the major, or a few good semifinals or something like that, as long as we get a decent major, if we get a decent major finish, this will be one of the best seasons of Counter-Strike we've had in a while. Certainly since Counter-Strike 2 has released. That's my opinion. So I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I think am I coping a little bit? Maybe. Do I just want to see Counter-Strike 2 really blow up? Do I want to see it continue to go from strength to strength? Yes, obviously, but I genuinely believe that we're in a really good spot for CS at the moment. So let me know what you think in the comments, and